Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today with your hosts, Kyle Buller and Joe Moore. Today on the show, we are joined by Mark Haberstroh. Mark is a friend of ours that we met at a retreat center a number of years ago and just kind of stayed in touch. He kept reaching out to us and we kind of kept the relationship alive. I think when we met him, he just co-founded a mushroom farm and was growing edible mushrooms for, I believe, farmers markets and restaurants in Alabama. And since then, he's really stepped into the psilocybin world by helping to co-facilitate retreats around the world in Jamaica, in Mexico, and in Amsterdam. And he's attended a lot of these retreat centers that have really emerged within the past few years. So he has some pretty interesting insights on just how people are operating and what to really look out for. And just, I guess, has his pulse on the emerging market, I guess you would say, in psilocybin retreat centers, since he's worked or volunteered at a number of them. And so we thought it would be really interesting to bring him on to share his experience with you. And hopefully, if you are planning on attending any of these retreats, to really kind of know what to look for, how to stay safe, and to get the most out of your experience there. So really excited to have Mark on finally. I know Joe did an interview with him for our clinicians class, exploring what to look for in retreat centers and kind of exploring his own process with it. So I think you're really going to like this episode. Mark's very insightful, as always, asking deeper questions. And that's been the one thing that's really stuck out in our friendship over the years, just seeing him kind of asking the questions, digging deeper, and really kind of pushing his personal and professional development. So yeah, really fun to catch up with Mark on a podcast episode. And I hope you enjoy this episode. Before we dig in here, just a reminder, we have some seats if you're listening to this before May 20th, 2021. We still have some seats left for our Navigating Psychedelics course for clinicians and therapists. So this is an 8-week live course. You get access to all of our online pre-recorded material and interviews with experts in the space. And then we meet online for an hour and a half on Zoom to create that classroom setting, to ask questions, to dig deeper into these topics and get a little bit more nuanced. So if you want to join us, you can check us out at psychedeliceducationcenter.com and then find the course Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. And the class begins May 20th. That's a Thursday. We have 2 groups, one at 2 p.m. Eastern Time and the other one is at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you're listening to this after the 20th, well, hey, we have our summer and fall classes up there too. So if you want to plan ahead, you can do so by checking that out at psychedeliceducationcenter.com and see if the fall or summer classes work for you. So we have some upcoming dates there. We'd love to have you. It's been fun teaching this over the past few years and watching some of our students step into the psychedelic space to various degrees, from getting jobs and working at psychedelic companies to maybe stepping more into the legal work with either ketamine-assisted therapy or providing integration work with clients. So definitely check us out if you've been wanting to know how to get started in this field and really just get a nice foundation and background in the psychedelic science and just the landscape and how to get involved. Join us at Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. And if you want to check out any of our other classes, you can do so at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. We have a Jung and psychedelics class. So that's a class exploring the theories of Carl Jung and how some of his theories really apply to the transpersonal and psychedelic experiences. And that was taught and presented by Johanna Hilla. We also have the Shadow series. So if you want to dig a little bit deeper into the Jungian concept of the shadow, check out the Shadow class. Really fun series I did with Dr. Ido Cohen. And we also have some free classes and webinars up there. So check that out. If you want to support the show, please subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, on Apple, iTunes, Google, Stitcher. And be sure to leave us a review on iTunes. That helps us out a whole bunch. Be sure to like and subscribe to us on all the social channels. And if you want to support the show, please share a piece of content. That helps us out a whole bunch. So share what we're doing, share it with a friend, family member, and just help to spread the word and mission what we're doing here at Psychedelics Today. And if you want to leave a monthly donation, You can do that at Patreon/psychedelics today, and leave a monthly donation there. Then that helps us to keep the lights on. So if you're feeling called to do that, you can go on over to patreon.com. All right. I think that is it, everybody. I hope everybody is having a wonderful week, and I hope you're doing well. So I hope you enjoy this episode with Mark Haberstroh, and we'll catch you on the other side. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe and Kyle here interviewing Mark Haberstroh. Mark, how you doing today?
I'm doing wonderfully.
Good.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm excited to finally get to record with you for the show. You, I think most notably on our platform, have contributed a masterclass to Navigating Psychedelics, which I'm super happy about too. How I describe you, Mark, is the person who's worked at more psychedelic retreats than anybody I know. and you're a real student of this psychedelic topic. And I just really excited to be able to share your experience and your work with our audience. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So Mark, how do you like to describe your story? Like before you were interested in therapeutic psychedelic use, like what was going on for you in the early days that got you interested?
I guess, to be honest, I've been thinking about it a lot lately. My first psychedelic was salvia back in the early 2000s.
Nice.
Right. I grew up in Alabama, and weed was super sketchy, but something I liked. And then I found this stuff that they sold in the head shops that was legal, and it was my first introduction to how the mind could kind of distort reality in a way. And it was fascinating, but not my cup of tea, salvia, in that way at least. And so I kind of dabbled here and there when I was younger in high school with other psychedelics, and it was fascinating, but I didn't get a whole lot out of it. I did it recreationally, and I was a heavy, heavy drinker from the moment I started drinking. It's something that runs in my family and was always, culturally really accepted. The town I come from is a football town, and like that's what people do. They drink a lot, and I just happened to drink a lot more and hang with the people who didn't make me feel like I was drinking so much until it just kind of snowballed out of control. And I had some really profound experiences with mushrooms back then that, taught me some life lessons. One of the main ones being not to panic. And it was like, if you panic, you're not going to make it home safe. And that is a lesson that really stuck with me. So I drank really heavily for 8 years, more and more as time went on. And for the last years of my drinking career, I was consuming about a liter of vodka every day just to get through the day, and more if I wanted to get drunk with my buddies. So it took me to a really dark place. There's a lot of talk in this world about the dark night of the soul, and probably can happen multiple times in a lifetime. And this was a big one for me. I forgot what happiness was. I can remember driving through town and seeing people on the street smiling and just wondering, what does that feel like? I don't remember. So I went really low, and luckily had a friend who was also a drinking buddy who worked at a hospital and ended up getting sent to rehab through his work. I witnessed him get better, and I ended up checking myself into rehab a few months later, sobering up. And in rehab, that saved my life. I'm a proponent of AA. It's kind of dated, but does the world a tremendous amount of good. I think when we're dealing with addiction, it's very much a life or death matter. They say when it gets bad enough, the only roads are jails, institutions, or death. And luckily I ended up in an institution. And
Amazing.
While I was there, though, I learned about Bill W., the guy who founded AA. lots of pros and cons with that guy, but something that they mentioned but nobody wanted to talk about in there was that he was a believer that if you'd worked the steps thoroughly, and the whole point of the steps is to have a spiritual awakening, if you didn't have a spiritual awakening, that you should try LSD. And that I found fascinating. And nobody would give me an honest answer about it. Now, having worked the steps and kind of stepped away from those things, I wholeheartedly agree. I think doing those steps and really taking a hard look at yourself in that way is wonderful prep work for a psychedelic experience. And so it was something I was curious about, and nobody would answer me honestly in rehab. And so I did my research and eventually Googled psilocybin retreats, and there was one that was public 5 years ago. So I went and had some very profound, life-changing experiences, and really helped me find spirituality, to be honest. Like in AA, it opened the door, but there I still had to take somebody's word for it, and hard for me to do that. When I was able to go and try psilocybin, it was like, oh, this is definitely a power greater than myself.
That's interesting. So you originally had this experience at a retreat center versus kind of like finding it on your own. And I guess like, what was that experience like for you?
It was intense. This is an interesting model. Yeah, a lot of energies mixing and people from all over the place and coming for all different reasons. In particular there, I kind of had this rebirth journey. And I had done some reading about Stanislav Grof and his work with going back, like the original trauma of being born. And I think that was still in my mind. And so the medicine took me back to the womb, and I got to my biggest takeaway was that I was in the womb. It was awesome. Everything was wonderful. I was so warm and held and taken care of. And I was waiting for something. And then I realized, oh, I'm waiting to be born. I'm waiting for this original struggle, the first struggle. And then it dawned on me that like, oh, I was born of a C-section. I was just kind of ripped into this world and I didn't have to fight for it. And oh my God, I've been creating struggle for myself ever since. And that's just been a pattern throughout my life. I think even with the drinking, like I was born in privilege and I was ashamed of that, what I was born into. And so I've just, up until I had that realization, I created struggle for myself. And sometimes I still do. It's a deep pattern, but I'm much more aware of these things now.
Mark, I don't know that we ever talked about the Grof stuff and the perinatal stuff when we were together, but I was also a C-section, and it's a really weird thing to discuss. Like what about it like was most interesting or helpful for you?
That realization, but it kind of just started the trip. There were so many people on such a high dose around me that there was a lot of stuff going on, and it was like I don't want to be in here. I want to be outside. I want to be alone, and they wouldn't let me go outside. So I just covered myself up with a blanket, and then that's where I went.
Yeah,
and once I birthed myself out of the blanket, then I went to the bathroom and like thought I was going to vomit, but I didn't vomit. However, it took me back to all of the times I'd been in a bathroom throughout my drinking career, and then just kind of like went through a review of my life.
Was this one experience the thing that really seemed like a pivot, or did it feel like you had to develop a deeper relationship with mushrooms?
Yeah, it's yes to both. Like this, just finding mushrooms in general, it gave me a spiritual path that like was personal and my own. And I learned that like in AA, it doesn't matter what you believe or what anyone else believes. It's a personal thing. And something I was fascinated by and wanted to learn more about. And so I just kind of dove into all things mushroom. I was attending trade school at the time for HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And this was something I was not passionate about whatsoever. When people would ask me what I was doing, I just there was no passion in explaining that. And then finding the mushrooms, I realized like, this is something I'm really interested in. And then I ended up going to a festival down in Costa Rica where somebody I
Envision.
met, yeah. And I've been there every year since. This will be the first year I don't go because it's not happening. And I went there just like, I hadn't been to many festivals. It was a real eye-opening experience, but somebody had asked like, if I use these things intentionally. And it was like, whoa, I've never thought about that. And then that's when I began learning about preparation and intention and integration. And it was so refreshing to meet people who I could talk to about these things and not be looked at like I was crazy. You know, when I went home to Alabama and I tried to like share all these wonderful insights and this crazy journey I had, very quickly I realized that people looked at me like I was a junkie or still a drug addict, alcoholic. And then I realized I used to think I was crazy, and then I thought they were crazy, and then I realized nobody's crazy. We're just uneducated. And I quickly realized that it's unfortunate, but when people don't know about these substances, they compare them to the substances they do know. And if I told them I was doing mushrooms, they equated it to like heroin and alcohol and other drugs. And it's like, oh, these things are so different, and people are so set in their ways. Not only would they not listen to me, but they wouldn't even see me. It was like I lost 100 pounds. I became active and healthy and happy, and I quit smoking for a time. Nicotine has been another battle, and luckily I've set it aside again, but nobody saw that. All they saw or heard was that I was using mushrooms, and that to them that was bad. And so everyone tried to talk me out of it. Or like, why are you going to these places? You're just doing another drug. And it's just like, I had to trust myself.
Was there a level of shame that came with them judging you talking about using mushrooms?
It was more like defiance and indignation, not so much shame, because I saw me, and like I said, I felt better than I had ever felt.
Right.
Still do.
Well, and that was like a really interesting thing to hear, is that they're really looking at the mushroom use versus losing 100 pounds, getting exercise, quitting smoking. So like, I think this is a pretty common like integration challenge for most people, especially when they come back to an environment that, maybe they can't communicate their experience because people that surround them are uneducated about the topic. And so how did you really cope with that or deal with that? Do you have any advice on like...
Find community. It was a real struggle for me. I spent 2 years very alone. And as I put myself out there more and I travel the world and meet more people who work with these things, it's so common, and like it can be devastating in a way not to have anyone to talk to about these things. I don't regret anything. It made me who I am today, but it's very isolating in ways. And it's the biggest problem I have with the retreat centers. And, even the ayahuasca ceremonies going on, I'm happy that it's all happening. I'm just a little bit, I just wish there was more aftercare. Like, people are leaving communities that don't understand what they're doing or needing, going to a community that does, where the stuff is offered, and having mind-blowing, life-changing experiences, and then going back and not having anyone to talk to who understands what they've been through. And I think a big purpose of these things is to help build community, and it's kind of a community activity in a lot of cultures, but not so much here. And that's why I think the clinical model is what's kind of taking off here, because that really focuses on the therapeutic model really focuses on preparation and integration. And in my eyes, I play with the percentages a bit, but I think the preparation is probably 30%. The journey is 10%. And the rest of it is aftercare and integration. So the other 60% of the work when it comes to these things.
Yeah, I think that's about right, Mark, for especially for like long-term change that lasts, right?
Right.
It's called durable change.
Mm.
Yeah. I'm sure science will help us flesh that out eventually, but it's probably going to be another 15, 20 years before we have that kind of data.
Unfortunately. I mean, we were done ourselves a huge disservice by making these things illegal 50 years ago and having the research halted for so long.
Yeah. Right. So we had a conversation for that masterclass, and we had a lot of, critical things to say about retreat centers that are available right now. But you maintain a certain kind of optimism that I kind of wish I had. But you're like, largely though, people come out better, even if there were some risk factors or some subpar things done at the retreat. Can you
Right.
talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. And I take these things really seriously, maybe even too seriously sometimes. And I've been able to pick out things that I don't think are right in every retreat I've been to, or things that I feel like aren't fully in integrity. For these places to run and to operate, they have to process a certain number of people in order to stay afloat, and generally run by or like facilitated by volunteers or a smaller staff. And when that many people are coming through, there's no way to keep up with everyone. What I feel is proper for the aftercare bit. However, even though I've seen things wrong in all of these spaces, or maybe I didn't agree with the leadership that I was working for, of everyone, almost, I don't know of anyone who's asked for their money back. Everybody gets their money's worth. As long as they eat mushrooms, they see benefit.
Right.
As long as the space is safe. And I haven't been to a place there where it wasn't safe. It just might not have been fully in alignment with my ideologies, which is great. I think that's something that's special about this line of work, is that there's never going to be enough of it, at least not in my lifetime, I feel. And everyone who does it, be it a one-on-one session or a retreat, like whoever's doing it is going to bring their own flavor and their own model, and everybody does it differently. And there's something I can learn from in the ways that everyone is doing it. And so I like to just tell people, do your research, get to know the facilitators, get to know the people who run the thing, and find what resonates with you. There's a million different ways this can be done.
Where was the first place you were? Was it in the one in Jamaica?
Yeah, the first one I went as a participant was in Jamaica, and I hit it off with the facilitators there, and they invited me back to be a facilitator, and that's where I met you guys. And then the next one I went to was in Mexico, out of Tulum, ran by a couple of lovely women, which was awesome to see. I think this is a pretty white, male-dominated business industry, which is unfortunate. We really need more diversity. And then, the next one was another retreat in Jamaica, a different one. And then I spent my summer of 2019 working for a retreat center in Holland.
So I kind of want to get, unfortunately, I like to go here, but like some of the negative stuff first, and then we can dig into like some of the better stuff second.
Sure.
So the second retreat in Jamaica you went to is an interesting one. I'm not going to name it, but the interesting thing that was going on there was that it seemed as though people were getting pulled down to do psychedelic work. Like they're going to do mushroom work and shamanism, etc., and be healed. But what was going on was it seemed like they were getting pulled into kind of like a voodoo or a Santeria organization. It was really down there for like, reading the future and doing that kind of spirit work, which was kind of separate from mushrooms. And it wasn't really forward. Can you talk about like how you felt about that, or like how clients might have thought about that?
That was one of the most disturbing things I've witnessed. And I'd just like to preface that all of the retreats I've been to, I did in 2018, 2019, and they're either no longer operating under a new name or under new leadership. And so I feel like everything has evolved a lot in the last year or two. But that one in particular that you're speaking about was a very strange experience. I was invited down because of the experience I had and the research I'd been doing on my own. And there was a severe lack of communication between the people who were coming down to run the retreat and the people who owned the land that we were doing the retreat on. And yeah, the people who owned the land, they had bundled in certain readings into the price of the package for the retreat. And I had no idea until I got there. And I was the lead facilitator, which was red flag number one.
Yeah.
But then I realized, and they even told me that their primary objective was to give these people this,
like divinations.
Yeah, I don't know if it was Santeria or not. It was a certain type of divination reading, which is like fine, cool. The I Ching, all these things, I find them fascinating. But what wasn't was that their focus was to pull people aside after their mushroom journey to give them these readings.
And did they have consent beforehand? Like, did they know what they were signing up for?
Not really. And they were pretty pushy. And it was like, for me, spirituality is crucial for my life. And I can find things that resonate with all religions. I think at their essence, they kind of lead to the same mountaintop. However, I draw the line at dogma. And these people felt like their beliefs were what everyone needed. And they weren't really going to tell people. They wanted, in my eyes, they wanted to take already vulnerable people, bring them down, make them more vulnerable, and then push their spiritual beliefs on them. And that's so not okay.
Right. It kind of rhymes a little bit with what Matthew Johnson at Hopkins has been saying about the facilitators pushing their religious dogma or their spiritual dogma on people who aren't necessarily interested in that. It's okay for it to be there, but it has to be in the right container. And you got to lead with it. Say, hey, we're doing this thing.
Right. With consent and be open about it.
I would be pissed.
Yeah. I don't think there was only ever 2 participants for that retreat. And it was a 1-on-1 setting, or 2-on-1 actually, which was kind of ideal, except for this part where they didn't really know. And one of the guys that came down was like, I don't want that. But then his wife was like, I guess I'm open to it. So they pulled her away.
How soon after the session?
Right after, 4 or 5 hours into it.
That's fucked up.
And were they advertising it as psilocybin assisted therapy? Did they use any of that advertising language there?
I'm not sure exactly. I mean, it was definitely a magic mushroom retreat in this setting, and like a vacation in Jamaica.
Yeah. Because I think that's something that I've definitely seen here and there. And, you guys were talking about bringing vulnerable people in and just thinking about how some places will advertise that. And then somebody gets there and it's not what they were necessarily reading about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and, those protocols. And maybe it was a little bit more different, or they're, doing other spiritual practices that they weren't too sure they were signing up for. And I think that's where it gets a little mucky, right? It's where's the consent there? And what are you doing at these retreats? And are you informing people before they go down there what they're actually getting into? Because it's targeting a very vulnerable population, right? A lot of us that have gotten involved in this are either seeking healing or transformation and change. And it can be really alluring to be like, ooh, look at this thing here. I'll change my life. And then kind of maybe getting roped into something. You're like, I don't know if I really signed up for that.
Right. It's really scary when I see participants asking if this is a cult. It's like, oh no, that's not.
Was that happening there?
Not at that one in particular, but it has happened at other retreats. And that's when I'm like, oh, I don't need to be here anymore if that's the vibe that's being put off.
So I guess let's talk about the possible harm there. There's a few different things I can see. So if we want to get a little spiritual with it, your energies are quite wide open. You're getting into this kind of divination space. You're not familiar with any of these spirits that people are working with. So you don't have a context for if they're safe or dangerous. I can see that being kind of traumatizing a little bit, or potentially spiritually harmful, right? When Kyle and I got back from Jamaica, we were smoked, and it didn't seem to me to correlate with any of the stuff that we did down there. And I think it took me 3 months to recover. So, and I didn't even eat mushrooms. So I'm like, what on earth was happening there? And I do think there's a weird, energy dynamic that we don't have the ability to really understand well yet scientifically. So I think there could be something going on there in a divination scenario that's really awkward, if and not possibly dangerous, or at least predatory. And then on the other hand, like, you're vulnerable. You're 5 hours from eating a bunch of mushrooms. Like I've seen friends at festivals go spend, $700 on a painting after they're like coming down from tripping, right? And like, is that the best decision? I don't think so, but that's the business model that the festival person has set up for themselves. And the artists have to make money too. I think artists should be selling stuff, but there's an ethical question there. Yes, you have money in your pocket and you're kind of consenting, but you're also under the influence of drugs. So like, what else is going on there in a divination scenario, right? Like, okay, cool. Like I showed you that I can see your future. Now come join my thing. Come learn to be a priest in my religion or something. Think about, okay, you spent all this money because you're desperate. You're like planning to kill yourself in 6 months if you don't feel better. So you go down and spend money to go on this retreat and you just comply and you do it. And then you're all traumatized about being manipulated, like on a more mundane level. Like you were manipulated and you were used. That's probably...
I wouldn't say that I've seen anything so severe. I've never bought a painting at these festivals, but I've been tempted. I mean, they're freaking awesome sometimes. But
yeah,
I have met people who like, on the bus ride to the retreat center were like, I'm planning to kill myself if this doesn't work. And like I said, even though I didn't necessarily agree with the modalities, I try my best to keep up with these people and they're all doing so good.
Good.
It was enough to disrupt whatever's going on. I felt like they could always use more aftercare, or I wish therapy wasn't so expensive. I think a lot of times people just need space and attention afterwards, or even like beforehand, like mushrooms aside.
Right. Perhaps what I'm seeing is like a lack of care around focusing on helping people feel safe. Like the feeling of safety is of the utmost importance. And sometimes people are put in scary situations to make them feel not at ease.
Well, and I think that takes time. I think that's really hard. Just thinking about like therapeutic relationships, like it can take a while to start feeling safe enough to really be vulnerable and open up. So, I mean, when we're thinking about like retreat models, how do you do that? Do you really check in with people multiple times before coming down with the facilitators so they do feel safe in that space? I don't know. It seems like it would be really hard, or a lot of resources, at least on the retreat level.
Right. And they're not always devoting the proper amount of resources. Some of them have. One that I worked for did spend a lot of time making video calls with people. However, it was just one person and the facilitators didn't know anybody until they got there. And so I felt like my job was like, how quickly can I build trust and vulnerability with these people? So they can feel safe. And that's, there's a lot of benefit to the group model. I think mushrooms in particular really expedite the community building process. And then a lot of times people leave these retreats with now lifelong friends. But it's much easier to build that trust and vulnerability with somebody one-on-one, having spent a few months preparing for the journey rather than just showing up and doing it. And I think the research is coming out now that I've been studying and learning a lot about MDMA. And I think this is going to be a wonderful therapeutic tool to expedite that process for us in the future. And something that we're horribly undereducated about. And I've honestly stayed away from and been biased towards because of what I've seen at festivals. And it's like an easy one to take generally, like with mushrooms. I love mushrooms because even as an addict, they're self-regulating. I don't know anybody who is eating mushrooms every single day. Even myself, that sounds horrible. However, I do see people eat MDMA for days on end. And it's like, whoa, like stuff is, from what I've gathered, relatively harmless at an appropriate dose once every 3 or 4 months. But at festivals, kids are just going and because we haven't been educated and it feels good. Sure, take more, whatever. But it's not healthy. And personally, from the friends I've witnessed do this, I don't see any like real noticeable damage other than the substance stops working.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be such a beautiful therapeutic tool. Like, that's unfortunate. Maybe they could benefit later when these things kind of get rolled out with all the stuff that MAPS is doing.
I'd say even the harmful use has benefit, like that, excessive use. I've done it plenty, right? Like I'm one of those people. I'll admit it. And, I still think it's beneficial. It certainly is gross. It doesn't look as angelic as, straight psychedelic work, but it's certainly still kind of cool. But, the issue is like not sleeping, not getting nutrition. Like you're doing 5 to 7 days in a row, barely any sleep, and you're using LSD and MDMA to stay up and whatever other, amphetamines will keep you awake.
Mm.
Like that's like the harm comes, I think, largely from the not sleeping and the poor nutrition, poor hydration. Yeah, totally. There's probably some harm, but we don't have enough data to even know what that is.
Right. We lack research on so many of these fronts, especially with MDMA, and a lot of people are talking about microdosing these days, and
there's no data. It's crazy.
Sometimes, exactly. People ask me about it, and I'm like, I don't know. Personally, I don't get anything out of it. We don't have any data. The placebo effect is really, really strong. But like, whatever. Like, same thing about spirituality. If you're happier, healthier, and it's working for you, fuck yeah.
Amen. Yeah. So let's circle back to something that's a little dark. Throw out a hypothetical for you, Mark. So you grew up in like rural Washington state, right? Like Tacoma or like somewhere way rural, no real connection to like city culture or anything like that. And all of a sudden, like you're got a substance use disorder, or you find a mushroom therapist that's willing to take you in the underground, and they got great credentials. A lot of people spoke highly of them, and you show up at their facility in one of the biggest cities in the country, and all of a sudden they're like throwing out some stuff that's super awkward to you, like sexual stuff, and you're like, wait, what? Like, I'm here for mushroom therapy. I don't want you to touch me. I just want to like be safe and held in this scenario. That's a lot worse than the scene that we kind of looked at the mushroom retreat in Jamaica you were talking about. But like, it seems kind of similar, right? You're like, oh, like you just don't know how to make people feel safe, and you're going to say stuff that makes them not feel safe. And you have no context for what people outside of New York City like think is normal or like whatever. You know what I'm saying? Like, there just seems to be some sort of overlap there. Like, I know what's best. I'm going to make you feel unsafe for a minute or your whole trip. And it just seems to be like a little bit of ignorance around what sets the stage for set and setting.
Right. And I think one of the scariest things to me is that a lot of times people will look really good on paper, but like, how do they really hold themselves in this space? How do they work with these very potent medicines that, like I said, taking somebody who's vulnerable and making them more vulnerable, and easily manipulated if you're not working with the right person. And there's a lot of predators out there in this world. And
yeah, dude, it's weird. It's a really weird scene. And like, some of these people who have the most credentials in the space are sometimes like some of the most horrific.
right.
Yeah. And not necessarily like being willfully harmful, right? It's maybe just ignorance and laziness, or like, there could be other factors.
Like in that scenario, creating a space where somebody might invite something in that they don't want. But like, then it's like, well, then the person just thinks it was their fault, or they invited it. But it was really the facilitator who created the space for the invitation when they knew that somebody was coming from this rural place for mushrooms. And then they start talking about other lines of work that they do that have nothing to do with it, that could, yeah.
Right. And it would clearly make somebody uncomfortable and feel wildly unsafe, especially when you're there for a sort of treatment, right?
Yeah. And just, and full disclosure, and you're kind of referencing something that has happened to me in my past. And I thought that all was good and well. I thought I had learned what it was like to be a woman in the world and have this guy look at me like a piece of meat for 5 hours while I was
Jeez.
under the influence of the medicine. And so I was like, oh my gosh, what a gift. I know how like a woman feels standing in the grocery store line when somebody's looking at her like an object rather than a person. And thankfully I had resources, mentors, and friends that eventually, after I'd shared and kind of come down from the experience, were like, that wasn't right. He went there for mushrooms and he started talking about BDSM work to cure homophobia. And it's like, both are okay, but the way in which it played out, I
Just
know.
like randomly showed up. It wasn't anything that like just came up and kind of consented to, just out of the blue.
It was in the preparation phases of this experience. They knew I was there to learn about mushrooms and felt the need to share that they did that, as well as in order to teach me to breathe deeply, needed to put their hand on my gooch was the word he used. And I was like, you know what? I'm good. I think I can breathe deep. That's not what I'm here for. And then it just led into a session where like I took,
That was substantial, right? That was like 7 grams or something.
10. It was the most I'd ever taken and the last place I ever thought I'd take them.
Good grief. Yeah, man. I'm
Years
glad you came out well.
Ago. But yeah, I'm grateful for the friends and resources I had to help me see that, like, that wasn't right. And this is still something I feel I need to confront. And I don't want to talk too much about it because I need to have a conversation before I feel if I need to continue to warn about it or not. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, thanks for going into that. I'm sorry I raised it that way, but it's, I'm glad you're okay chatting about it.
I'm an open book.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And like the lack of community response on it was the most alarming thing to me. Like, oh, whatever, it's fine. It's like, no, it's not fine. It's not whatever.
I was sent there by a woman who is pretty well known in the research department of this work, and she told me I had to do it if I wanted to learn more about mushroom use and continue my own education. And she promised integration afterwards, and I got no help, and she didn't want to believe me because this is the only person she'd ever worked with.
Right. It's tough. So I hope folks listen to this and learn from it. Like there's a lot of accountability we have to take for things we do, things we say, especially if you're going to continue supporting these people. Like let's use Octavio Rettig as an easy example, right? Like he's a really well-known 5-MeO-DMT facilitator and pretty well documented that he's probably responsible for a few deaths in some of his sessions. And he's still facilitating, as far as I understand. People still love him. He also uses an electric prod device, like a taser, on people in their sessions and pours water down their throats, which, like, from what I understand, 5-MeO-DMT suppresses the autonomic nervous system and people can get water in their lungs. And like the videos, like I showed a couple nurses, they're like, that is definitely water going in their lungs. I think they call it aspiration or something. And like this dude is a medical doctor and he's still doing this and he thinks it's okay. Like if something goes in someone's lungs, they can get a terrible infection and be hospitalized, if not die, just from that. So, and people are still talking about him like he's a good facilitator, and I'm like, blows my mind. And it's similar to this story that you're sharing. Go ahead, sorry.
I haven't really looked into this guy. I don't know about him, but it just brings me back to do the research. Like I know people who are starting retreat centers that on paper look like the ideal facilitators. However, they don't have empathy. And it's like, how can you do this work without empathy or understanding people? It's all about people. It's service work.
Yeah. So what are some things to like look out for when people are doing research? I know people have a hard time even knowing where to start, where to look, what types of questions to ask. So do you have any like tips and advice for like how can people do a better job at vetting the retreat center that they're going to, or just kind of preparing themselves for that?
I think it's honestly really hard. The first thing is like, what kind of model are you looking for? Do you want more of a one-on-one experience? Do you want a ceremonial experience? Do you want a completely open experience, more of a recreational thing? All of these flavors exist, and it's whatever you're looking for. And then try to get to know the people who run the space. Are they going to connect you with the facilitators before you come? Are they going to spend time with you before you come? Are they just doing it for the money? Is it $10,000 to come for a few days? Is there any aftercare? Or like most places I've been to, they just connect everybody through WhatsApp and let the WhatsApp group integrate itself. And it helps, sure, but it's not. I'm hoping to see more spaces open up where there's like a whole staff of, now with everything being on Zoom, like cyber therapy sessions, and like come here, and with the price is included 5-hour-long Zoom calls with a therapist that understands this work.
Yeah. What would, I guess, could you go into a little bit more detail about like maybe like an ideal model of like what you would like to really see? I mean, I guess you started that, but any more details on that end? I mean, I think about that and it's like, how expensive would that be if you included that? I mean, I feel like that would be ideal, right? Being able to connect before and after. I think the retreat center that I went to in Costa Rica did a really great job at kind of creating that safety early on. And I think they offer like group sessions, like virtual group sessions to anybody that's like been before. And I haven't really gone to any of them yet, but maybe it's something I'll jump in at some point in the future. So it seems like they're trying to do stuff as well, like kind of building that online community space with virtual calls and groups.
Totally. I think like the most affordable way to do it would be like weekly integration circles with one of the facilitators from the retreat. And then maybe there's a more expensive package where you get the therapist one-on-one. Ideally, these things form themselves in every community around the world, and the community creates the model for itself. And not only is it like the same people working together and getting to know each other better and helping one another, but like it's going to be interesting to see how it unfolds.
Yeah.
Like I said, 5 years ago, there was one public retreat, and now there's probably 100.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think about like my time with breathwork and like our work at Dream Shadow. And I think like, what has like made that really unique and special? Like when I'm thinking about like going to other breathwork retreats, and I think something that made it feel special was that it was a central location and there was a community that kept coming back to that one thing versus like, going to modules all over the country, meeting different people. Like, there's like this sense of familiarity of going back to this one place and the same people and new people showing up, but there was a community there. And, I think that's something that you've hinted towards a few times, and just talking about the community kind of self-organizing. It's like, everybody has to go to these other countries to have these experiences, and then they come back and they may not necessarily kind of have that community to come back to, and maybe have their own integration circles and build community. And I think that's the one thing that a lot of us are struggling with. It's like, where is our community? How can we develop that? And as decriminalization efforts take hold, if drug policy changes and maybe some of these things become legalized in certain contexts, like what kind of new systems will form and what type of support networks will form in the community. Sure, people will still want to get away and have those exotic vacations and retreats, but like if things start to change, what type of systems can we really build that the healing happens, back home?
I think from what I've gathered, that's how it's been more traditionally done throughout history. These things have been around forever. We just kind of forgot about them or became afraid of them. And it is a community-based medicine. But also, I think, back to your question about how would it be ideally, I think it comes down to intention. And what is the person dealing with? Are they dealing with severe trauma that they can't even really talk about? Then maybe a 2-on-1 clinical model is better. How about the retreats? What are the intentions of the people coming? Like right now, it's just like, who wants to come? Everybody come gather. We need your money. But I think it would be a lot more effective if it was like, all right, this retreat this month is going to be for recreation. This retreat next month is going to be for veterans, facilitated by veterans. The retreat the next month for addicts, facilitated by addicts, and so on. And like a creatives retreat. Just more intentionality behind the groups coming together, even. And I mentioned how that changed it for me when somebody mentioned doing these things intentionally. That radically changed my life. And it started with being more intentional with my psychedelic use, which spilled over to, wait, why don't I just live my life more intentionally?
Right. Hard to do, but it's a practice.
It's not, it's the journey, and it's not the first step. It's the next step that matters the most.
So what do you have in store in the future? Are you trying to just keep getting educated and learn from elders and hopefully be able to find a good space in the movement long term?
Yeah, that's where I'm at. One thing I'd like to talk about, is different models. But for myself, I've been very blessed to be able to travel to all these places and work a lot with the things I'm passionate about. And in this country, I found that I just want to learn more about mushrooms in general. So I started gourmet mushroom farms and then kind of move on, which has been a lot of fun for me. However, at this point with the psychedelic stuff, I've felt like, okay, I'm getting a little bit out of my depth. I need to become more trauma informed. I need to learn more about therapies. So currently I'm back in a school that's a bit more of a progressive school. And I've kind of said, I'm going to set the psychedelic stuff aside and work on me for the next couple of years.
It's awesome.
There's no rush. And like, I found my passion and my purpose. What a gift for me to have discovered this when I'm so young. And now I get to just I want to be the best that I can be. I want to help people get the most out of a single experience. I don't think for me, it's certainly not a one and done thing. For some people it is. But I think the more I work on myself and the more I educate myself, the better I can be at helping somebody maximize the benefit from a single dose.
100% agree. I think that's so important, and just love that you're saying that right now. And something I guess that just popped in my head was, you're talking about being more trauma informed. And I wonder, at some of these places, did you see the staff being really trauma informed at times, like having that education to really know how to work with that? Because I think that's so important. And I think, I don't know, some of the stuff I've seen isn't always there. And how are you supporting that when it is coming up?
Instinctually, I want to say not at all, which is sad, but true. And luckily, there's some regulations here in the US where you can't just call yourself a therapist, but over in Holland, there's no laws against that. You can call yourself a therapist or say you're offering therapy without any therapeutic education.
Oh, wow.
Right. So again, do the research, reach out to these people, talk to them, get a feel for them, see what their background is, because the websites can be rather misleading. And even then, like if they're well educated, unfortunately, like I know clinicians that want to do this work because they read about it. And when people read about it, it's like, oh, this is the panacea. Well, the panacea doesn't exist. And
Right.
they think that they know best because of their education. And, I feel like I kind of shush myself because I have no formal education. I've just learned through experience and taught myself. But I know clinicians who want to do this work and they don't know anything about it in reality. They've just read the theory, and that's great. But like reading about it is one thing, and sitting with somebody in deep sorrow, reliving something horribly traumatic and being there with them.
So
yeah.
different.
And like finding the line of compassion, but also allowing space. I like to say this work attracts really compassionate people, and that is awesome. But sometimes when people are deep in the medicine and they're really processing this horrible experience, they don't need anyone. And to witness somebody going through that, I almost always feel a pull. Like I want to go and comfort this person, but I know better. I don't comfort unless I'm invited. And even then I wonder. But I've seen people really, really deep going through something horrible, and one of the facilitators goes and puts their arm around them. And, that's not horrible. But then talking to the participant later, they were like, I was going through this thing, I was working through it. And then when that person touched me, it snapped me out of it and I wasn't able to go back. And then they feel incomplete. So there's a lot of nuance, and it's very intuitive work as much as it is.
Totally. Yeah. Something you were just saying about theory reminded me when I started to work with people with like early episode psychosis. I mean, that was definitely like a huge focus of mine during like my undergrad, and just thinking about like spiritual emergency and Groff's work. And I remember I was talking to my advisor once I started, or no, they weren't my advisor, but just somebody I really looked up to. And they're like, yeah, theory goes out the window pretty quickly once you start working with humans. And I was just like, yep. All that stuff that we trained for, all these like, transpersonal theories around what this is, out the window completely.
Interesting. And I've worked with a lot of therapists and psychiatrists, and I go see a therapist once a week, and hopefully we'll be able to afford to do that always. But all these people I talk to tell me that they've learned a lot more in practice in their work, actually doing it than the theory, which is interesting to me. Don't discount that whatsoever. It's why I'm stopping going to retreats right now, because I want more theory. I want to learn more and be more informed. But
yeah, theories, I think, is important, right? It helps, like something that we always say in our class talking about this. It's like theory provides like the map and the framework, but it's not necessarily the territory, right? Territory can shift. But at least having something to help you ground and like just refer to is very helpful. And that was something I was talking to one of my teachers about when I was working in this place. Sometimes I felt like there was no foundation or theory, and I was trying to bring all this like, I don't know, kind of transpersonal framework in. He's like, it's really hard to know what you're doing when there's no direction, there's no map, there's no foundation. He's like, it's helpful, but you also need to be flexible because it's also not the territory. And I think we need both of that, right? We need practice, and we also need some sort of foundation, some theoretical map that we can just at least grasp. Totally. and go after when we're feeling really confused about a situation. It's like, oh yes, this is what they say, or maybe I could try this.
It never hurts to have more therapeutic tools in the toolbox.
Exactly.
You never know what's going to come up for somebody, and maybe not necessarily during the session, but afterwards, being able to offer like, hey, have you ever read about internal family systems or other things, like just resources, just to help resource people based on what I've learned.
Yeah, right. And I think that's like what you're doing when you're learning a theory, right? You're putting more tools in the toolbox and just more like things to grab for when you need it.
Yeah, I just, I personally began to feel like I was getting out of my depth and wanted more tools. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing now.
What kind of made you, I guess, become aware of that? Because I think that's like, it takes a lot of self awareness to realize like when to pull back and like when to pause some of that work. Like there's definitely been times when I had to like pull back on certain workshops just because wasn't feeling resourced at that period of my life and needed some space away from things. So I don't know, what was your process of like understanding that for yourself?
I guess just the people I was beginning to attract, it was not so much the quote unquote healthy normals anymore. It was people dealing with more trauma and more addiction, and then being like, wait a second, I smoke cannabis every day and I'm still smoking nicotine. Like, how can I help somebody with addiction when I'm dealing with addiction myself?
Mm.
Both things I have now set aside for some time, and it's just something I still think about and investigate. And even without those in my life anymore, it's like sometimes I overeat or I drink caffeine every morning, and like I'm not going to beat myself up over these things, but become more aware of. I guess one other thing I wanted to touch upon is like how different these things are. I think anybody who's coming to this podcast has heard the saying set and setting, and working. Obviously, it depends on your mindset. What are you going through? What's on your mind, and then the setting. And in my experience, laying on my yoga mat the whole time by myself is completely different from doing the same thing with a guide, which is completely different from doing it with a group or walking in the woods and connecting with nature.
I want to talk about that walking in nature thing,
Sure.
Mark. Like how you've been the one that kind of convinced me that I was like, when you first started telling me about it, I was like, oh, that sounds dangerous. And then I'm like, you know what? It's actually, that's a pretty classic way of doing it for a lot of folks. And a lot of people get a lot of value from it. Like what do you feel like the difference is from like being quiet alone on a mat versus like strolling through the woods?
They're both beautiful in their own right. I think lying with it on my mat is more like deeper inward journey, and like becoming more conscious of ways I distract from things in my life, or more likely to have harder material come up, things that maybe I'd forgotten about that really affected me in my childhood that I hadn't fully processed yet, versus going out into the woods and like walking for 5 hours and just still having insights and perhaps directions and conversations I may need to have, but a much more heavy emphasis on just a complete awe and appreciation for the beauty of nature that I may not have had. I grew up playing video games, and at one of these retreats I was walking through the wood and I was like, oh my God, I grew up having nature pre-packaged and sold to me for $60, an adventure. And like, I've been ignoring actual adventure in my own life. I need to sell my PlayStation. And I didn't do it so fast because I still used it for other things, but versus like that time where I got to be reborn and go through my whole life by staying on the mat and not getting up to go outside and distract myself, or realizing just like, yeah, it becomes a practice, because sometimes when the scary material is about to bubble up to the surface, the body will do everything it can to distract from going there. Like, oh, I got to go up and pee. I just peed. I'll just stay here now and face this stuff. And it seems, I don't want to say one's more beneficial than the other. I think it's all beneficial, at least for me in my life.
I think that's a good way of looking at it. Yeah. It's I think a lot of people get nervous.
Sure.
Because somebody somewhere might get hurt, I was at the beginning
Definitely a
of this.
possibility.
Yeah. But I'm thinking about this like earlier in our conversation, just like, do we as a culture not have enough risk tolerance? Like, I get that if we're a provider, like we should be doing everything possible to keep people safe. If they're paying us money, like that's kind of the right thing to do. You want to mitigate all the risks that are possible to mitigate. Within a reasonable degree, because you're not going to do everything. But like, shouldn't people have, a little bit more risk tolerance? Like, Kyle, we were talking about your snowboard accident with Lenny the other day, and you're like, isn't this a lot more dangerous than mushrooms?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many times I've almost killed myself snowboarding, and then that one time literally.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then I always come back to like, it seems like we're so afraid of psychological fears of somebody going crazy or somebody having a bad trip versus like trying to control and regulate the snowboarding industry or skydiving, bungee jumping, hiking, bike riding. There's like all these dangerous things. Like if we were really worried about like safety, physical safety of people, I mean, these things would probably be regulated a little bit more, right?
And you bring up a great thing, Kyle, like this idea of, oh no, somebody might have a bad trip. It's like, so fucking what? Like it might be traumatic, but like there's also a great chance it'll be super beneficial. And it's also quite educational having a bad trip.
Right. This is so true. I don't like to use the word bad trip anymore. Right. I say difficult trip or difficult experience. And
hell yeah.
Every time these difficult entheogenic experiences, generally with the proper resourcing and time and integration, turn into some of the most profoundly beneficial experiences for people.
Yeah.
And talking about safety, it makes me think of a lot of children I know and the parents that I respect the most. I don't have any of my own, but I love to see parents who let their kids go out and adventure and aren't so protective. Some parents try to control their children and are too afraid of them of getting hurt that they never, it kind of stunts their growth in a way.
Yeah.
It seems.
Yeah. And I guess something that I've been kind of thinking about, and maybe was kind of part of this ethics thing Joe and I and Lenny have been working on. It's kind of like the politics of experience, like who gets to control experience. And, one thing that I was thinking about is just like mental health disorders and how we treat people with mental health, right? It's like, as long as you're not a harm to yourself or others, like why having a particular experience is that a bad thing, right? And I guess we could look at something like schizophrenia or psychosis. It's like if somebody is having an experience, they're not harming themselves or others, then why should we say that that's like bad, right?
Totally.
Unless it's like really negatively harming their life and they can't function and, again, danger and harm to self or other. If they're having just these experiences, why are we so afraid of these experiences? I guess that's a question too. Is it because we feel like we can't control reality at that point? And so we have to try to box it in, say, don't experience that. And if you are experiencing that, then we get to dictate how you should live and what medication you should be on. It's just interesting to think about like psychological and spiritual experiences and like the politics around it.
I couldn't agree with you more. It makes me think of some psych nurses I know and how disgruntled they are working in the system where the patients, sounds like, are a lot of times not heard and just kept in a space and doped up rather than, trying something different.
I want to mention like one dangerous, like to us as gringos, like what we might see as a dangerous religious ritual is like the Sundance, right? Where they have hooks in their backs. And that's, totally legal. It's in some circles, like in some BDSM circles, it's also a kink. And then if you want to go into the kink land, there's some wild shit that goes on. Just kind of, I'm only using the term deviant because it's like a math term, right? Like it deviates from norms. And so, not very many people do it, but it's totally legal to buy these rods that'll, stretch out different parts of your body. Like stuff like urethra stretching is like a big deal in some circles, which blows my mind, but some people love it. It's like, that's certainly not illegal. there could be long-term medical consequences, but people are still doing it, right? I'm in the middle of the Carl Hart book right now, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, it's called. And even this idea of going psychotic, it's like you don't like going it requires a diagnosis to be called psychotic, right? But sometimes you might have features of your experience, might have symptoms that line up with psychosis. And, it's not necessarily bad because it's kind of short-lived. Like it's not kind of totally crippling your life, even in a therapeutic session. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah, no, and I just think about what is like the main kind of harm here that most people talk about is having a bad trip and doing something dangerous, like jumping out a window, which, sure it happens, but probably very rare. But it always seems to come back to this argument that you could have a break of some sort. You're going to have a bad time. You might not ever come back from an experience. And I just find that to just be really fascinating that it seems like to some degree, we're more focused on these psychological experiences versus like actual physical harm at times.
Yeah, this is making me think of a few things. I've gone to conferences around the world for psychedelics and talked to some of the scientists that are actually doing the research in the studies. And it's like, from what I've gathered, we're really focused on what the negative side effects are to the mind and body, and then just the positive effects to the mind. But we aren't even looking at the positive physiological effects yet.
Which are substantial.
Right. For me personally, huge.
I think there was just a paper that came out. I didn't read it, but about like anti-inflammatory effects and stuff like that.
Right. That was David Nichols' son, is doing a lot of really interesting anti-inflammatory research. I think DOI was one of the drugs he's looking at because it's effective at super low doses for like anti-inflammatory stuff. So I hope to see more of that. Like the physiological stuff, I think is incredible because of like possibly reversing brain damage from injuries, all sorts of amazing possible applications that have nothing to do with tripping, not necessarily.
And you brought up Sundance, Joe. That's such an interesting ceremony. I've been fortunate enough to be invited to a dance the last
Did you go?
2 summers to Oh yeah, I helped keep the fire.
Oh, hell yeah.
It's such an honor to learn from Lakota people on their land in South Dakota. And I've seen a lot of different ceremonies, and this is the most intense one I have ever witnessed. And it was considered a felony up until 1973, I believe, is when.
Yeah, they tried to outlaw it, I remember.
It was outlawed,
yeah.
Like punishable by jail. They did their best to wipe out these traditions, and the Lakota people were resilient enough to keep it around and kept it kind of in hiding. And now they're inviting a white guy from Alabama to come help them keep fire and learn from them. It's
amazing.
It is. And every bit as like, whoa, that's such a powerful ceremony. And witnessing these people that dance and fast for that time, it's
a full 7 days of fasting?
4
days, and no water, no food.
Right.
Jeez.
It's incredible. Wow. Like, yeah. I love this line I heard once about the Sundance. It's like you go in and you're like pretty sure you're not going to survive without the help of spirit. And it's like you have to really trust that spirit's going to be with you. Otherwise, you're not going to make it, because it's a grueling, you're not just hanging out in chairs, like not sweating and not burning calories. You're doing a lot, right?
That's the most powerful form of prayer I've ever witnessed.
Wow.
Yeah.
And the people who are doing it are some of the best people I've ever met. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Wow. I just want to say something quickly, and I guess just backtrack on what I was saying. And I just wanted to get people to maybe just think about like that idea of like politics of experience, but also just want to acknowledge that, people have had really difficult experiences where it did really profoundly change their lives in negative ways. And that is a possibility, and just don't want to come off as like dismissing the psychological dangers there. I mean, we've brought that up a few times on the podcast about possible like fallout from the Renaissance here with psychedelics, and what type of challenges are we going to see as more people engage in this? And yeah, so I just wanted to kind of clarify that.
Well, let's spin on that. Like, what if both of you, like, what kind of numbers do you think we'd see, or are we seeing right now, like real quote unquote fallout, like between HPPD and like real deal, like hospitalizations? Like what do you think we see currently or might see in a post-prohibition world?
I don't know. I mean, I guess like the data isn't really there yet, but I mean, just thinking about the people that reached out to me in general to talk about like increased fear of death or suicidal thinking after an experience, really difficult integration sessions after 5-MeO, kind of like the existential despair, not really knowing how to get back into the groove of things. And, these are these psychological issues that arise that can cause somebody significant distress and, impact their lives negatively in different ways. Will that increase as like the general public starts to become aware of this and maybe they're not taking precautions? But then again, how many people have already been doing this and just not talking about it?
Right.
That's another thing to consider.
That's the part that scares me. And I like to, something else I've forgotten to mention is that when you're looking into these retreat centers, this is a completely unregulated field. It's wide open and people are doing whatever they think is right. Fortunately, over in Holland, there is a community-built group of people called the Guild of Guides. And if the retreat center is a part of the guild, there is some regulations they have to follow to be a part of that society. And then there's regulations with the clinical field here in the US and certain underground communities that abide by rules, but for the most part, completely unregulated. And we talk about these things as if they're wonder drugs and there's no negative effects. And I don't understand why, because, it's common knowledge the possible harm with SSRIs and other antidepressants when mixed with psychedelics or entheogens. However, I've witnessed a few hundred, maybe more journeys now, and I would say I've seen 4 or 5 people faint after mushrooms, and nobody talks about that side effect. And blood pressure medication is another contraindicator. If they're taking blood pressure meds to lower their blood pressure, they shouldn't be taking mushrooms with that medicine because they could faint. It could lower their blood pressure too much.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting all that. That's really important to consider. And yeah, people not doing that research and getting themselves in a situation. Somebody reached out a while ago saying after an experience, they ended up falling, kind of same thing, like blacking out, falling, hitting their head. Yeah, it happens.
And the dips, I think you just kind of alluded to it. Like you read How to Change Your Mind or other books about entheogens, and it's like, oh, this is going to fix me and everything's going to be great. But a lot of times after a journey, people get worse before they get better. And that's when the resourcing is needed the most, the therapy, the aftercare.
Yeah. And, spend some time in like HPPD forums on like Facebook or Reddit. I mean, there's a lot of people struggling, and, reading some of those posts also make me realize like, wow, yeah, it's not always light and beauty for people. And, I know there's definitely strong critiques about HPPD, but, it was definitely something that affected me in my early 20s. And I can say that was significantly stressful in my life. And I never wanted to wish that experience upon anybody. But I mean, it was the experience that kind of got me more fascinated into this field, because I needed to feel like I needed to understand the experience better. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, Joe, do you have any thoughts or ideas about that question that you posed?
I think let's just, as an exercise, call us all professionals in the psychedelic space, because we are. And we have a professional inclination, or I guess obligation, to try to keep people safe. And I think at times our language can make people more fearful and add to a negative set. And, oh, mushrooms can be really dangerous. It's like, well, fuck no. They're like this, they're far safer, according to David Nutt's research, than just about anything out there.
Sugar. They're safer than sugar.
Maybe water is slightly safer. Right. Like, totally. And, like Carl Hart's phrase that the primary effect of drug use, and we'll say like, non-prescription drug use, like the primary results are largely good. And that's going to be a hard pill for us in the psychedelic world to swallow, because we're kind of judgmental, right? Like if someone takes a methamphetamine pill, like we get nervous, right? Like we're like, oh shit, are they going to get addicted? Are they going to have some harmful results? I'm like, well, not really. Yeah, there's a little bit of a risk profile there, but as long as we understand that risk profile and we're educated consumers, hopefully, which most drug users aren't on account of prohibition. But, as we educate and as we have a safer supply, like I think that's what post-prohibition world is about, right? Like safer supply, better education, and better services. Right. We're going to do fine. Like heroin's fucking safe as hell.
This makes me think of what I've read about Vietnam and the veterans over there. They were worried about bringing everyone back because there was so much heroin use, and then people came back. It was about
only 20 or 30% of people stayed on it when they came back.
Mm-hmm.
And drug use eventually self-resolves. Like if you can stay alive and safe enough, like these drugs, like the use generally subsides. You can die from an alcohol detox. You can't, in simple terms, you can't necessarily die from a heroin withdrawal.
That blew
you're
my
gonna feel like
mind.
Shit for a while.
When I found that out in rehab, is Xanax and alcohol are the two substances where the withdrawals kill. Everything else you just need to sleep and rest off. And you may want to die, but it's not going to kill you.
Yeah.
Don't they work with both of them on the GABA system? So like there's something there with GABA that's really interesting. I would like to know more about that. Yeah. And like what is that? Like drug harms are pretty minimal. Yes, there's risks. Yes, I've seen some fucked up stuff in the festival scene. I've seen some dangerous stuff in the fish world. I've definitely seen people get taken off having seizures. Like I remember tripping pretty hard once and 2 people around me had seizures and had to get taken away. For whatever reason, I was like, okay, they have medical attention. They're going to be fine. I don't know how they ended up. And so like largely, I don't know what to do with that. Like I've definitely seen some bad things.
Yeah.
But largely, I think the fear of going to jail, like negative, like what are the social, I feel like I'm cheating on our paper, Kyle. Like what are the total costs here of like this drug war? Like I can't have a conversation with the police anymore.
Right.
Like I'm terrified of the police. Wouldn't it, in Europe, like you're too fucked up at a festival, they take you home.
Right.
Like they'll drive you home safely.
This was something that came up with some friends I made over there that had done a lot of work. They'd worked for Zindo and they had worked for other safe spaces at festivals in Europe. And they were like, it's so much worse in the US because in Europe, if somebody is feeling bad at a festival, they go to the equivalent of a Zindo tent and they're like, hi, I'm feeling this. I took this, this, and this. Whereas when they were in the US and they were working at like a safe space, it was like, I'm feeling terrible and I didn't take anything.
Right, because you don't want to disclose that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And
I'm going to disclose something that I broke the law once. Or let's have you finish your story, Mark. I'll take a note.
I was just going to say, in Holland, there's a public service that you can send your drugs to a fully legitimate lab and they'll tell you exactly what's in it without any worry or prosecution. It's just for the safety of the population. Whereas here, we can get test kits, but there's nothing like that. And everyone is really paranoid.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, reagent testing, doesn't show everything, right? If you're able to send that in to a place that does like, what is it, mass spectrometry?
Yeah, mass spec.
Get those like high level readings, at least what's in there, right? I mean, with reagent tests, you have to literally test for everything to see if it shows that.
Right.
And sometimes you're going to miss things.
And there's new
Right.
chemicals. I mean, Mitch Gomez was just on our class and he was saying there's new chemicals every day and our reagent tests probably aren't going to pick that up, right?
Right. That's why I've kind of stayed away from MDMA because there are better kits now, but they'll test to see if there's MDMA in it, but they won't test for the other stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And that's, why I go a little overboard with when I'm doing like a multi-panel reagent test. Like I'll use all of them, not just 4 of the primaries reagents. Like I'll try to get a very broad thing here to go, okay. And it gives me a little bit more certainty. Like it's certainly not, 100%. But I think people often want guarantees, right? Like they want 100% when they're going to make a decision. And that doesn't really exist in nature, right? Especially in social situations where humans are quite unpredictable and incentives are all crazy. And so back to my point about like, maybe we need to become a little bit more tolerant of risk as opposed to, oh no, like you might lose a toenail, or like you go on statin drugs for like cholesterol or blood pressure or whatever statins are for, and you get this phantom limb pain. And it's apparently proven to be a nocebo effect, but you're like that nocebo effect is a real risk factor for taking this drug, and you're still going to take that drug. Mm-hmm. And like a lot of these prescription drugs that doctors are going to prescribe have far higher risks than a lot of these recreational or intentionally used substances will have.
Yeah.
So like, why are we going overboard on drug policy? And even in our own community, like, why are we saying, oh, I'm only into plant medicine, or I'm only like, I feel like using that term plant medicine is kind of a cop out for some people. It's like, I'm not smoking crack, so I'm fine. My drug use is okay. And this is me again, ripping off Carl Hart. Like,
isn't everything technically natural if it exists?
Yeah, man, absolutely. Like nature is the totality.
Came from somewhere.
We create artifacts. Yeah, man, totally.
I feel too that like a really big lesson I've gotten out of working with these medicines is that I really can't control anything. I mean, it's good to be mindful and careful and safe, but also like I'm a lot happier when I'm not trying so hard to control my life or the things around me.
That's some good advice.
Yeah.
Good advice.
Right. There's limits to your control and influence. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind.
There was something that came up a little bit earlier, and I was just thinking about like, I guess, drug use and mental health, and doing some research. There was a paper talking about like the medical model of mental health. And there's a quote in this paper, and maybe we can find it and put it in the show notes. But it was really kind of just challenging our kind of view of what mental health is. And is it really a disease? Are there any biomarkers for it? But there was a quote in there that just really has me thinking about this conversation in general, where it was like, anxiety, depression are these kind of survival mechanisms at times. And do we really need medical interventions? Maybe we medical solutions to social problems. And it's like, we need social answers here. How many of these are actually, it's all kind of increased because of, societal structures. And why are we trying to fix it through these other ways when, is the system sick? And is that really where we need to focus? And just so thinking about the drug war too, and drug use in general, right? Is it a medical thing, or could it be societal at times? And
what way do you mean that about drug war?
Just the way we view it, right? Like,
you mean pop culture?
Yeah.
For us.
Yeah, pop culture and just like the general public, right? Like, somebody, and I know this is definitely up for debate, and there are kind of biological factors here when you're overusing substances, but really not viewing it from a societal answers, right? Like changing those structures versus like, oh, this is, this person has a disease, they're, bad, we need to, fix it this way, versus like, well, like, filling the prisons like any good, and why are people using substances? Is it that we live in somewhat of a sick society at times, and, maybe people are coping in different ways?
I may be a bit biased, but I think you're totally right. I think there's a lot in society that needs to change for us to be happier and healthier. And I try very hard to live my life in the reality that I want to be a part of. And when I'm working a 9 to 5 for somebody else, it makes me sick on a spiritual level. So I do things to try and create my own stuff. I start gourmet mushroom farms where I can grow and experience growing mushrooms legally, and then insert nutrition into my community, as well as compensation.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a chaotic time right now, but I think we're also witnessing a real paradigm shift. And it's what we need societally. We need to think about, reevaluate, and revamp the education system, the prison system, the medical model that likes to put Band-Aids on things rather than getting to the root cause of the issues.
Yeah. I agree there with you. Cool. Well, I see we're at like an hour and a half. Maybe we should start wrapping up. This has definitely been a fun conversation.
Yeah, Mark, anything we might have missed?
I feel like we touched all the bases I was thinking about leading up to this. I really appreciate you guys.
Yeah, really appreciate you too. Do you have any kind of website or social presence you want to point out, or maybe we can add that later on?
Yeah, if anybody wants to reach out to me, I'm an open book and love to talk about these things. You can either email me at ourcelium.mark@gmail.com, ourcelium.mark, M-A-R-K, or our.celium on Instagram at our.celium.
Great. Well, Mark, it's been really fun, and I hope we get to do it again in a few months after summer strikes and the mushrooms are back in the wild for you.
I'd love to.
Yeah, great.
Thank you all so much.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, Mark. All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that episode with Mark. I know Joe and I really enjoyed it. And like I said, Mark is a very insightful person, and I think has a lot of wisdom to share and just a lot of insight from his experiences by attending a lot of these retreat centers across the world. So hope you learned something. Hope you took something away from this. And if you're planning on going to a retreat in the future, yeah, I'm hoping that this was just helpful information for you. And again, if you want to support us here at Psychedelics Today, be sure to subscribe to us on wherever you listen to your podcast, and follow us on all the social media channels. If you have any questions, comments, you can send us an email at support@psychedelicstoday.com. Definitely updated our email. So yeah, support@psychedelicstoday.com if you have any questions or comments. And yeah, I hope everybody has a wonderful week ahead, and we will catch you on the next episode of Psychedelics Today.